On July 20th, 2026, standing in front of a crowd celebrating the anniversary of his own revolution, Nicaragua's president made an announcement that ended nearly 2 decades of pretending. His country, he told them, would never hold another election. Not delayed, not postponed, ended. There won't be any more elections here, Daniel Ortega told the crowd, for them to try to seize the government and seize power. It was the 47th anniversary of the day Sandinista fighters marched into Managua and ended one family's 40-year grip on Nicaragua. Ortega was there for that too. A young guerrilla in his early 30s, one of the men who helped write the final chapter of the Somoza dictatorship. To understand how strange that sentence really is, you have to understand who was saying it. Daniel Ortega is not a monarch. He didn't seize power in a military coup, the way the Somoza's founder once did. He is a former revolutionary who spent years in prison, years in exile, and years losing elections he refused to rig. Before, slowly and deliberately, over 2 decades, building something that looks almost nothing like the government he once risked his life to overthrow. Standing beside him at that July 2026 rally was his wife, Rosario Murillo, not merely the First Lady, but since a constitutional reform passed a year before, his official co-president. Constitutionally guaranteed equal power, and next in line if his health, at 80 years old, finally gives out. This is the story of a revolution that promised, above everything else, to make sure Nicaragua never again lived under one family's permanent rule. And it's the story of how that same revolution, led by the same man, ended up building one anyway. Not with tanks, not with a coup, but with a pact here, a court ruling there, a law, an amendment, until, one July afternoon, there was simply nothing left standing in the way. This is the story of exactly how a democracy disappears, not all at once, piece by piece, until the day someone finally says so out loud.
Aquí no volverán a haber elecciones. No volverán a haber elecciones para que por ahí intenten ellos atrapar el gobierno, atrapar el poder.
To understand Ortega, you first have to understand the dictatorship he grew up trying to destroy. For most of the 20th century, Nicaragua was ruled by a single family, the Somozas. It began in 1937, when Anastasio Somoza Garcia, commander of the National Guard, a force originally created and trained under United States military occupation in the early 1900s, used that command to seize the presidency for himself. The Guard had been built, on paper, as a professional political force meant to stabilize the country after decades of civil war and foreign intervention. In practice, whoever controlled it controlled Nicaragua, and Somoza made sure that whoever controlled it would always be him, and eventually, his sons. When the elder Somoza was assassinated in 1956, shot by a young poet at a party in Leon, in one of the more startling episodes of the era, power simply passed to his son Luis, and later to his younger son, Anastasio Somoza de Bell. Between the three of them, the Somoza family controlled Nicaragua, with only brief constitutional interludes, for over 4 decades. Elections still technically occurred throughout. They simply never produced a result the family didn't already control. The Somoza regime wasn't just authoritarian. It was a business empire that happened to also run a government. By the 1970s, the family and its closest allies personally owned an estimated 1/5 to 1/4 of the country's arable land. Along with the national airline, shipping lines, cement plants, and construction firms that again and again profited directly from national disasters. That pattern reached its most infamous point after the devastating 1972 Managua earthquake, which killed thousands and leveled much of the capital's center. International relief aid poured in from around the world, and much of it, according to widespread reporting at the time, was diverted, resold, or funneled into companies controlled by the Somoza family, while ordinary Nicaraguans were left to rebuild their own capital with almost nothing. Opposition to the Somozas had simmered for decades before that, but it was the earthquake and the naked corruption that followed it that finally pushed a genuinely broad cross-section of Nicaraguan society. Students, priests, business owners who had previously tolerated the regime, and a small but growing core of armed revolutionaries into open organized revolt. That armed resistance took its name and its symbolism from a man who had been dead for decades. Augusto César Sandino, a nationalist guerrilla commander who spent the late 1920s and early 1930s fighting a stubborn, improbable insurgency against the United States Marine occupation of Nicaragua. Sandino agreed to lay down his arms in 1933, after the Marines withdrew, and was assassinated the following year on the direct orders of the National Guard's founding commander, Anastasio Somoza Garcia. The very man who would go on to found the dynasty Sandino's name would eventually be used to help destroy. Sandino became a martyr almost immediately, and in 1961, a new generation of Marxist-influenced revolutionaries formally adopted his name for their movement. Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, or FSLN. Among the young radicals, the FSLN drew into its ranks over the following decade was a student from Managua, born in 1945, the son of a family that had itself been quietly harassed for years over its own opposition to the Somozas. A young man who studied law at Managua's Central American University before dropping out to join the movement full-time. His name was Daniel Ortega. Ortega joined the FSLN as a teenager in the mid-1960s and rose quickly through its ranks, not through ideology alone, but through action. He took part in bank robberies, kidnappings, and armed operations designed to fund a movement that, for its first decade, had almost no money and almost no international support. That kind of activity is what got him arrested in 1967, at just 22 years old, in connection with a bank robbery in Managua. He would spend the next 7 years in prison, much of it under conditions later described by human rights observers as brutal, an experience that, by his own later account and that of his biographers, hardened both his political convictions and his personal resolve in ways that would shape the rest of his career. He was freed in 1974, as part of a prisoner exchange negotiated after a squad of Sandinista commandos stormed a Christmas party in Managua and took a room full of senior government officials and diplomats hostage. A dramatic, almost cinematic operation carried out with theatrical precision that announced the FSLN, for the first time, as a serious discipline threat to the regime rather than a fringe nuisance. In exchange for the hostages' release, the Somoza government agreed to free a group of political prisoners, fly them out of the country, and pay a substantial ransom. Ortega was one of those freed. He went into exile in Cuba, where he received formal guerrilla training from Fidel Castro's government, one of the FSLN's most important and most controversial international patrons, before slipping back into Nicaragua clandestinely to help direct the final phase of the insurgency. By 1978, the uprising had grown from scattered, isolated guerrilla cells into something closer to a genuine national movement. That August, Sandinista commandos seized the National Palace itself, taking the entire Nicaraguan Congress hostage in a raid that stunned the country and in retrospect marked the beginning of the regime's final unraveling. Through 1978 and into 1979, the FSLN's three internal, often mutually suspicious factions, including Ortega's own more pragmatic, alliance-building Tercerista wing, which had spent years quietly building ties with non-Marxist business leaders and moderate opposition figures, finally agreed to unify under a single joint command, a move that dramatically widened the base of the revolution well beyond its original hardline Marxist core. On July 19, 1979, a date Ortega would return to, symbolically, again and again for the rest of his career, Sandinista forces entered Managua as Anastasio Somoza de Bail. The last of the dynasty fled the country for exile and eventual assassination in Paraguay the following year. The regime that had ruled Nicaragua for over 4 decades collapsed in less than 2 years of open civil war, at a cost historians estimate at somewhere between 30 and 50,000 lives. Ortega became one of 5 members of the new governing Junta of National Reconstruction, formed to lead the country's transition. And by 1981, its dominant controlling figure, formally taking the title of Junta Coordinator, the country's de facto head of state in all but name. It's worth pausing here, because this moment defines everything that follows. The Sandinistas hadn't simply won a war. They had inherited a genuinely broken, impoverished country, decades of extraction, a devastated economy, a largely illiterate, rural population, and almost immediately found themselves fighting for survival, all over again. This time against a very different, far more powerful adversary. The Sandinista government's early policies made its new enemies clear, almost immediately. Land reform redistributed hundreds of thousands of acres, largely former Somoza family holdings, to peasant cooperatives. A nationwide literacy campaign, still cited today by historians as one of the more successful in Latin American history, cut illiteracy rates dramatically within just a few years. State control expanded over banking, foreign trade, and the assets of the old regime's business empire. And the new government moved quickly to build close diplomatic and military ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union. None of that reassured the incoming administration of US President Ronald Reagan, who took office in January 1981, already viewing Sandinista Nicaragua as a potential second Cuba, taking root on the American mainland at the height of Cold War tension in Central America. Beginning that same year, the United States began covertly funding, training, and arming an insurgent force drawn largely from former National Guardsmen who had fled after 1979, along with disaffected peasants and indigenous communities alienated by some of the Sandinistas' own heavy-handed policies. This force became known simply as the Contras, short for Contrarrevolucionarios, counter-revolutionaries. What followed was nearly a decade of brutal, grinding civil war, fought mostly in Nicaragua's rural countryside, far from the cameras and capitals of the outside world. Historians estimate the conflict ultimately cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides, displaced hundreds of thousands more, and crippled an economy already straining under a US trade embargo. The war also produced one of the largest political scandals in modern American history. The Iran-Contra affair, in which senior officials inside the Reagan administration were later found to have secretly sold arms to Iran itself under a US arms embargo at the time, and funneled the proceeds directly to the Contras, in deliberate violation of a congressional funding ban passed specifically to stop exactly that kind of support. The scandal, when it broke in 1986, nearly brought down Reagan's presidency and remains, to this day, a case study in executive overreach. In the middle of this war, in 1984, Nicaragua held elections. Ortega was formally elected president, with roughly two-thirds of the vote, in a contest Western observers viewed very differently depending on where they sat. The Reagan administration dismissed it outright as a sham, staged for international consumption. Independent observer delegations, including several from Western Europe, took a more measured view, judging it reasonably free and competitive if conducted under undeniably difficult wartime conditions, with real restrictions on opposition media access and campaigning. By the end of the 1980s, the country was exhausted in every sense of the word. Hyperinflation, driven by war spending and economic collapse, reached its peak somewhere in the range of tens of thousands of % annually. A Cordoba banknote from that era, framed today in a Managua shop window, would have needed to be printed in the millions just to buy a loaf of bread. Militarily and emotionally, the country had simply run out of road. In 1990, under intense pressure from Nicaragua's own exhausted population and the international community alike, Ortega's government agreed to hold internationally supervised elections against a newly united opposition coalition, led by Violeta Chamorro, the widow Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, a prominent newspaper publisher and Somoza critic whose 1978 assassination had helped ignite the original revolution, and who had, by 1990, become an unlikely unifying figure for a country simply exhausted by war on every side. Ortega lost it, and in one of the more remarkable, and frankly underappreciated, moments in modern Latin American political history, he accepted the result and peacefully handed over power. A moment that, for years afterward, was held up by supporters of the revolution as proof that, whatever its many flaws, the Sandinista project had produced something the Somozas never had in over 40 years. A government genuinely willing to lose an election and go. It would take Daniel Ortega 17 years and 3 consecutive failed campaigns to get that power back. Out of power, Ortega spent the 1990s rebuilding, but not necessarily rebuilding as a Democrat. Through that decade, he ran for president again in 1996 and 2001, and lost both times, as a Nicaraguan electorate still broadly wary of the Sandinistas, and now also courted by an increasingly organized liberal party, kept him consistently out of office. Each defeat, though, taught him something that would matter enormously later. In a genuinely fragmented political system, you don't necessarily need to win over a majority of the country. You need instead to permanently fracture your opposition into smaller, mutually hostile pieces, and control the institutions that actually count the votes. In the early 2000s, Ortega struck the arrangement that would define the next phase of his career. A controversial political deal with Arnaldo Alemán, Nicaragua's sitting president, and the dominant figure in the rival Liberal Constitutionalist Party, who was facing his own looming corruption investigations as his term wound down. Nicaraguans still refer to this arrangement simply as El Pacto, the pact. In exchange for Ortega's political cover shielding him from prosecution, Alemán agreed to a sweeping set of reforms to Nicaragua's electoral system, courts, and comptroller's office, engineered jointly by both men's parties to divide institutional control between them and freeze out any third force. Buried inside those reforms was a single seemingly technical change that would prove more consequential than almost anything else in this story. Lowering the threshold needed to win a presidential election outright in the first round, from an absolute majority of 45% down to just 35%, provided the leading candidate held at least a 5-point lead over whoever came second. It's difficult to overstate how important that one number would become. It was a rule seemingly custom-built for a divided electorate, exactly the kind of electorate a twice-defeated Ortega was all but guaranteed to be running into again. At the same time, Ortega worked methodically to rebuild his public image. He softened his once fiery revolutionary rhetoric considerably, formally reconciled with the Catholic Church hierarchy he had clashed with bitterly throughout the 1980s, and in a move that startled many of his own former allies, backed a complete total ban on abortion in Nicaragua, with no exceptions, widely understood by analysts at the time as a calculated bid to win over conservative Catholic voters, and just as importantly, the institutional backing of the Church itself. Ahead of his next run, in 2006, running against an opposition still badly divided across multiple competing candidates, Ortega won the presidency with just under 38% of the national vote, comfortably clearing the pact's lowered threshold, in an election he would, in all likelihood, have lost outright under the old rules that existed before he helped rewrite them. 17 years after he'd been voted out of the presidential palace, Daniel Ortega was back inside it. He has not left since. What followed 2007 was a slow, patient, remarkably methodical process, dismantling, one institution at a time, nearly every check that stood between Ortega and total control of the Nicaraguan state. In 2009, Nicaragua's Supreme Court, by then stacked with enough Ortega loyalists to control its rulings, struck down the constitutional ban on consecutive presidential re-election, on the grounds, remarkably, that the ban itself violated Ortega's individual human rights. The ruling cleared his path to run again in 2011, which he did, and won, in a vote condemned by both international and domestic observers for widespread irregularities, ballot-stuffing allegations, and an opposition still too fractured to mount a serious challenge. In 2014, the National Assembly, by now firmly controlled by Ortega's FSLN, went further still, formally abolishing presidential term limits altogether through constitutional amendment, and simultaneously folding the military and national police more tightly under direct executive command, blurring lines of institutional independence that had, at least on paper, existed since the 1990s. By 2016, Running for what was now his third consecutive term since returning to power, Ortega made his most significant structural move yet. He selected his own wife, Rosario Murillo, as his vice presidential running mate. Murillo was, by that point, already a formidable political figure in her own right, the government's de facto chief spokesperson and communications strategist for years. Known for a distinctive, almost mystical public rhetoric blending Sandinista revolutionary language with New Age spiritualism, and widely believed by analysts and former insiders to already hold significant, informal power over government messaging and personnel decisions. It's worth pausing on that partnership, because it isn't simply a marriage of convenience. Murillo has long been described, by outside analysts and by former officials who left the government disillusioned, as arguably the more powerful and more feared of the two figures at the top of Nicaragua's government, controlling day-to-day administration with an intensity that, as Ortega's own health has visibly declined in recent years, has only grown. By the mid-2010s, Nicaragua retained most of the outward architecture of a democracy: regular elections, an active legislature, functioning courts, a written constitution regularly amended through proper legal procedure. Independent watchdog organizations like Freedom House had, by then, stopped describing the country as a democracy at all, categorizing it instead as what political scientists call a competitive authoritarian system, one where elections still technically occur, opposition parties still technically exist, but where the ruling party controls enough of the referees, the media, and the opposition's basic ability to organize freely that the actual outcome is rarely in genuine doubt. The real test of just how far this particular system could still be pushed arrived in 2018. In April 2018, the government announced a package of social security reforms raising worker and employer contribution rates while simultaneously cutting pension benefits. In response to a genuine worsening fiscal crisis inside the country's Social Security Institute, the reforms themselves triggered protests, modest ones at first, led largely by pensioners and university students. What turned those scattered demonstrations into a full national uprising wasn't the policy itself. It was the government's response to it. Riot police and armed pro-government groups moved violently against the initial protesters in a crackdown that included, in a moment that shocked much of the country, regardless of political affiliation, direct attacks on elderly pensioners themselves marching peacefully in the streets. The backlash exploded far beyond the original pension dispute, becoming the largest and most sustained challenge to Ortega's rule since his return to power in 2007. For months that followed, students, business leaders, farmers, and ordinary citizens across the country built and held barricades, demanding that Ortega and Murillo resign outright. The government's response, according to extensive documentation compiled by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and multiple independent international rights organizations, was severe and sustained. Independent estimates put the death toll at well over 300 people killed over the following months, with thousands more injured, arbitrarily detained or forced into exile abroad. The Ortega government has consistently, and to this day, rejected that characterization entirely, framing the entire 2018 uprising instead as an attempted soft coup, the government's own preferred term organized and financed by domestic business elites, the Catholic Church hierarchy, and foreign interests, most explicitly the United States, seeking to destabilize and ultimately overthrow a sovereign, anti-imperialist government. In what officials describe as simply the latest chapter in the same external pressure the revolution has faced, in one form or another, since 1979. Whichever framing anyone finds more persuasive, the practical, measurable outcome of 2018 is not seriously in dispute. By the end of that year, the uprising had been crushed. Independent media outlets and non-governmental organizations had been shut down, or had their legal status stripped, by the hundreds. And the political space available for any organized opposition to Ortega had narrowed dramatically, a narrowing that would continue, year after year, in the period that followed. By the time Nicaragua's next presidential election arrived, in November 2021, the government had taken the strategy it developed in the aftermath of 2018 to its logical, final conclusion. Rather than risk facing organized opposition candidates at the ballot box again, it simply removed them from the ballot before voting ever began. Over the course of 2021, in the months leading directly up to the vote, Nicaraguan authorities arrested at least 7 potential presidential candidates, nearly every credible figure capable of mounting a real challenge, along with dozens of other opposition politicians, journalists, and civil society leaders. Most were charged under a sweeping new law criminalizing actions deemed to undermine national sovereignty. A law, critics argue, was written deliberately broadly enough to criminalize almost any form of organized political dissent whatsoever. With every serious challenger either imprisoned or already in exile, Ortega won a 4th consecutive term. In an election that the United States, the European Union, and the Organization of American States all publicly declined to recognize as legitimate. A judgment Ortega's own government dismissed, consistently, as unwarranted foreign interference in Nicaragua's internal, sovereign affairs. In February 2023, in a move that drew condemnation even from governments that had otherwise remained relatively cautious about criticizing Nicaragua directly, the government stripped the citizenship of over 300 people it formally deemed traitors to the homeland. That group included more than 200 political prisoners who had only days earlier been abruptly released from prison and flown directly into exile in the United States, trading, in effect, their physical freedom for permanent statelessness in the only country most of them had ever called home. By 2025, the legal architecture went further still. A constitutional amendment eliminated dual citizenship in Nicaragua altogether, giving the government dramatically broader legal grounds to strip citizenship from any critic or dissident living abroad whenever it chose to act. By this point, Nicaragua's opposition, in any organized, functioning sense, had effectively ceased to exist inside the country's own borders at all. In January 2025, the National Assembly again, unanimously, as had become customary for anything the FSLN leadership proposed, approved the most sweeping constitutional overhaul since the Sandinista government's original 1987 constitution. The new charter formally created the office of co-president, granting Rosario Murillo equal constitutional authority alongside her husband, not a ceremonial or symbolic title, but full, equal executive power, with both co-presidents jointly coordinating the legislative, judicial, and electoral branches of Nicaraguan government. The presidential term itself was extended from 5 years to 6, quietly pushing the country's next scheduled election from November 2026 to November 27. The reform also formally declared Nicaragua a revolutionary and socialist state, enshrined the FSLN's own red and black party flag as an official national symbol alongside the Nicaraguan flag itself, and critically, for what would happen 18 months later, restructured the military and national police to sit more directly under the co-president's personal command, including the creation of new voluntary reserve forces that analysts widely describe as a newer, more loyal, more informal internal security apparatus, answerable to the family rather than to the state as an institution. Multiple legal scholars and human rights organizations have described the reform's central purpose in blunt terms: securing dynastic succession. With Ortega in his 80s and reportedly in visibly declining health, the co-presidency structure ensures that, in the event of his death, Murillo assumes full presidential authority automatically and immediately. No election required, no transitional period, no opening whatsoever for any rival, inside the FSLN or outside it, to contest power at the exact moment it would traditionally be most vulnerable. It is, in the most literal sense available under modern constitutional law, the legal architecture of a family dictatorship, built methodically, one amendment at a time, entirely through institutions that were on paper still functioning exactly as a democracy's institutions are supposed to. Which brings us back to where we started. On July 20th, 2026, the 47th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution's triumph over the Somoza dynasty, Ortega took the final step in a process 2 decades in the making. Nicaragua's next general election, already delayed once by constitutional amendment, from November 2026 to November 27, would not be delayed a second time. It would simply not happen at all. "There won't be any more elections here," Ortega told the crowd, "for them to try to seize the government and seize power." Language that, notably, draws no real distinction between a violent coup attempt and an opposition candidate simply winning a free vote. In the government's own consistent framing, the two have always been treated as functionally identical threats to the revolution. The international reaction was swift and largely unified in its condemnation. The United States State Department called for coordinated international pressure against what it explicitly termed the Ortega-Murillo dictatorship. Human rights organizations and regional bodies across Latin America issued similar statements within days. Analysts who have tracked the country closely for years mostly described the announcement not as a sudden escalation, but as the final, almost honest admission of a system that had already stopped functioning as a democracy years earlier. The formal removal of an election that, in any genuinely competitive sense, hadn't really existed since at least 2021. Rather than stage yet another election, Ortega and Murillo were already fully confident of winning. The co-presidents simply chose to eliminate electoral competition altogether, closing off, permanently, even the theoretical possibility of a future opening for dissent. For a government that spent 2 decades building the appearance of legality around every single one of its moves, it was, in a strange way, the first entirely unambiguous step. There was no court ruling to point to this time, no law, no amendment. Just a microphone, a crowd, and an admission. Step back from Nicaragua, specifically, and this story tells us something considerably more general about how democratic backsliding actually tends to work in the modern world. Ortega's Nicaragua didn't collapse into dictatorship through a single dramatic coup in the mold of Pinochet's Chile in 1973, or the Somoza family's own original National Guard takeover in the 1930s. It happened gradually, mostly through processes that were, on their face, entirely legal. One incremental step at a time, a political pact that quietly lowered an election threshold, a court ruling that removed presidential term limits, a law that criminalized dissent under the broad banner of protecting national sovereignty, a citizenship reform that turned exiled critics into stateless people overnight, a constitutional amendment that built methodically a mechanism for hereditary succession without ever once using a word like monarchy. Political scientists who studied this pattern globally, from Hungary to Venezuela to Turkey, each following its own version of the same basic playbook, increasingly describe this as the dominant modern path to authoritarianism. Not tanks rolling through the streets, but the patient, legal capture of the very institutions, courts, electoral councils, legislatures, even citizenship law itself, that are specifically designed to prevent exactly this outcome from happening. By the time the final visible step arrives in Nicaragua's case, simply announcing, out loud, that there will be no more elections at all. The institutions theoretically capable of stopping it have usually already spent a decade or two being dismantled quietly from the inside by people who never had to fire a single shot to do it. It's worth noting, too, that this pattern rarely requires public enthusiasm, only public exhaustion. A population fighting hyperinflation, or a war, or simply trying to get through a normal week, will frequently trade a distant abstract institutional safeguard for short-term stability, and rarely notice which specific safeguard just quietly disappeared until years later, when there's no safeguard left to miss. That, more than any single individual's ambition, may be the real subject of this episode. Not simply who Daniel Ortega is, but how ordinary, how legal, and how patient the tools were that got him here. In 1979, a young guerrilla fighter helped end one family's 40-year grip on Nicaragua, in the name of a revolution that promised, above everything else, that it would never let anything like that happen again. 47 years later, almost to the day, that same man stood in front of a crowd and closed the last remaining door his own country had left to ever change its government by any means other than his family's permission. Somoza needed the National Guard to hold Nicaragua for 4 decades. Ortega, so far, has needed something far quieter. A pact, a court ruling, a citizenship law, a constitutional amendment, a title shared with his wife, and eventually simply a speech delivered on a stage he had stood on dozens of times before. The uncomfortable lesson of Nicaragua's last 20 years isn't really about one man's ambition, however considerable that ambition clearly was. It's about how rarely dictatorships announce themselves clearly in advance, and how often, by the time one finally does, the institutions that were supposed to stop it have already quietly stopped working. Years before anyone outside was paying close enough attention to notice. Somewhere in that gap between the last moment a safeguard still worked, and the first moment anyone realized it hadn't for years, is where most modern democracies that disappear actually go. This has been Strata Outpost, where history meets strategy.